All right, so first episode of a new little series that we're going to be running here over the next couple weeks, months, however long it takes. Um, so obviously with this, the immersive programming series, we're going to really dissect all things programming, and this is honestly one of my favorite things to talk about. I've always really enjoyed the premise of programming in general. So we're gonna, we'll dive into a lot of different topics. In this first episode here, bear with me. This will be more of the kind of general overview, 10,000 foot view, and this will be less of my own material and more just kind of covering some basic points on programming, utilizing some other resources. But as we go along in this series, it'll continue to get more specific to the way that I like to do things or the way that we like to do things at Rude Rock. And it'll also, we'll get some guests on here too and kind of get some different perspectives and dynamic on here. But as I mentioned, for the sake of this first one, we're going to be kind of broad and general here. But for the series in total, to give you just a little bit of a preview here, what we're going to try to do here is provide in-depth overviews and different programming types, concepts, applications. As we all know, there's a million different ways to go about programming, so we'll cover some of that. In addition, discussing some strategies, frameworks for building out programming, and then really trying to emphasize the decision-making aspect and the auto-regulatory aspect. And those are the two things that I really tend to focus the most on when it comes to programming, is really just the element of decision-making and how can I make things or create things in a way in which they can become a little bit more auto-regulatory, both for the coach and for the end user. But we will start out here with this quote, and this is something that most coaches should have at least been introduced to, if not ascribed to. But all models are wrong, some just happen to be useful. And I think that's something that perfectly summarizes programming, because really it's so context and variable dependent. We can look at anything on a sheet of paper as it's populated and say that it's good, bad, or otherwise, but how it really materializes in action or in person is a different ballgame. So bear in mind as we're going through this and as you're going through your programming process that, everything is right just as everything is wrong. It really just kind of depends on how it is, really developed or put together. And, that kind of bleeds into another point, that programming can uniformly be described as this blend of art and science. And so it's this constant process of observation, apply, and then analyze. And, I try to look at all programming as being a living, breathing document, that there's never any, end point or finished point for a program. It is constantly being evolved. It's constantly being altered and refined from there. So we always want to see these programs as being living and breathing documents. So to start out here with our 10,000 foot view, what is programming? Well, programming in a technical sense is the organization and the process of applying physical stresses through the application of exercise. And we tend to get a little bit lost in our own head sometimes as strength coaches, with all of these different sophisticated models and all these different terminologies and crafty things. But really, at the end of the day, all we're doing is we're just applying physical stress in an organized sense. And when this is done correctly, exercise programming can optimize physical capacity for developing skills. So at the end of the day, at least when we're talking about, in an athletic context or in, perhaps even in a military context, the whole premise of training is to improve physical qualities and capacity so that we can develop skills for what we do. Now, if we're talking about general fitness or recreational populations, there's a little bit more room for interpretation there. Sure, training can be done in a way in that it is just most conducive to behavior and is going to most likely be consistent for the user. But when we're talking about performance training, that's it. That's all it is. Applied stress through a time window that we are organizing and manipulating as we go along. And with these, the primary factors, as we know, are going to be the load or the intensity, the mode, the type of training, how much volume or how much work is being accumulated, how often we're training, and then how long we are training for. So by taking those variables in jest and mixing them up, we can create different programs that include pretty much the same exact things, right? This is where, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, but this is where I definitely have created a delineation point between exercise selection and training parameters. And I think that the parameters are much more influential than the actual exercise selections themselves. But when we bring this into an organized fashion, the basic programming types that we're going to work off of are either going to be a linear or a reverse linear, some form of conjugate loading, which was popularized by Louis Simmons and the West Side team, but those can either be done as weekly undulating or daily undulating programs. And in this graph here, we see a combination of a linear program, which is going to be represented by the white bars here, and we see it's very simple. A week goes by, we do a little bit more. A week goes by, we do a little bit more, and that can be, both in terms of intensity and or volume. Then for the undulating periodization, we see we have a higher percentage here in week 1. We drop down to what looks to be about 50% in week 2. Then we're back up, back down, back up. The difference between weekly and daily undulating is in daily undulating, it's going to be this same high-low type of model, but instead of it being across weeks, it's going to be across days. And, this is something that's been done for several decades. So, I hope none of the the grandmasters of strength and conditioning spite me on this, but Cal Dietz is somebody who, really popularized or repopularized some of the undulating concepts through his work with triphasic training. In addition to those, though, we have a return to play or a bridge type of program. So this is one where an athlete is coming off of an injury and we need to kind of get them, reintegrated back into a standard training environment. And sometimes those programs are going to be a little bit more of a hybrid and a little bit more unpredictable. Finally, we have autoregulatory, and you see the asterisk there. The asterisk there represents what I am constantly trying to work towards. So irrespective of what type of program it is, whether it's designed as a linear, conjugate, et cetera, I am always trying to work the athlete towards becoming more autonomous or capable of overseeing their own programming, so to speak. Even though that may not actually be the case, I want to try to treat them as such so that they have a better ability to understand what's going on. And collectively, these are going to be the way in which we're going to decide between a linear, conjugate, daily, or weekly undulating. Really, it's just based off of skill, age, training age, what point in the season they're in, what type of resources you have, what type of space you have, and then what the competing variables look like. But generally speaking, for novice athletes or for people who are just getting started, a linear program in some form or fashion is going to be perfectly sufficient. Whereas you get more advanced with your training, typically a weekly or a daily undulating program is going to be a little bit more preferential for you. Then we have this fancy term, supercompensation, and this is one where, again, whether we're working off of a linear or a conjugate model, supercompensation is really going to be at the empirical root of our training stimulus. So this is unequivocally the basis for every effective training program that's ever been written. Essentially, again, we are just dosing different stressors over the course of time to invoke a response. So we go through the training process over a few weeks, and that drives the body physiologically down. We come into a recovery period, start to regenerate, and then when we get back around to our training point, ideally or theoretically, right, we start back at a higher level than we initially started at. So when you have a higher starting point, even if you have the same amount of drop-off, that drop-off is not going to be quite as low. So it doesn't take quite as much effort or time in recovery to get back to that point where you're able to train again. Now, the caveat to this is obviously supercompensation has some level of threshold. If it were just this simple, everybody would always continue to get better, and that's clearly not the case. But in jest, supercompensation is really just aligning your training loads with your recovery periods so that we can induce some type of physiological adaptation that's going to increase the overall capacity of the athlete. Importantly, all athletes or individuals do not respond uniformly to stress. And in similar fashion, not every day or every week will be the same for the same individual. So again, this is one of those things where on paper it looks fantastic, but we have to make sure that we are interpreting things correctly as we're going along, as opposed to just assuming or projecting that things are going to go the way that we want them to. So we're constantly going to be manipulating, the amount of stress or the amount of volume as we're going through these windows, understanding and considering the competing variables, and then making sure that our recovery periods are determined in advance as opposed to just being responsive. That's a very key point. If recovery is not preemptive, this supercompensation concept does not apply quite as well. And lastly on that, the more highly trained somebody is, the longer the window for adaptation time is going to be, right? If you continue to get better and better and better at something, you have to work harder for less return. In addition to the supercompensation effect, we have something that is known as residual training effects, and there's a lot of room for interpretation on these, so please just take this for the point that I'm trying to make. It does apply differently based on different constructs or different factors, but in general, different training modes or types, so our strength endurance versus our conventional strength versus power, have different lasting windows. So to make this a very easy example, our aerobic system is predominantly a cardiovascular endeavor. There's not a lot of neural involvement there. If we're doing things like 3-mile runs, or if we're doing long duration circuits in terms of training, because there's a low nervous system involvement, there doesn't need to be as much iteration in order to create the adaptation. So in other words, if I can run a 6-minute mile and I can hang clean 300 pounds, if I go out today and run a 6-minute mile, I can theoretically do nothing for the next 30-ish days, give or take, and still go out and run a 6-minute mile, no problem. With the 300-pound clean, if I can clean 300 pounds today, generally speaking, I have about a 5 to 8 day window before those numbers start to drop if I don't continue to train it. That's a really important concept to understand, because this is how you're going to sequence together your training modes. So for me personally, I generally work from more of an aerobic based application down to more anaerobic based modalities or applications. In this little graphic here, this is a little excerpt from Cal Dietz and Matt Van Dyke from Triphasic Training, which I'm going to reference a few times throughout this, but this is their model and how they break it out, which is termed to be accumulation, transmutation, and then realization leading up to competition day. So as they have it broken out here, for that accumulation period, we're looking at about 4 to 6 weeks, whereas the transmutation, we're looking at 2 to 4 weeks, and then for realization, 1 to 2. Now, this is as Cal typically does it, and I think this is just a general one for him as well. But these terms here, these mesocycles here, generally correspond to over 80% intensity for accumulation. We are just trying to really build a robust capacity for strength, for hypertrophy. And then from there, we're going to go into our transmutation phase, which is actually going to descend in intensity, and we're going to start to work down between 80 to 60%. And then in the realization phase, we're going to drop below 60% and just start moving really fast. So for this example here, we have that accumulation period here in the first 4 to 6 weeks. And then you see this blue line that extends down 14 to 22 days. What this is suggesting is that the adaptations that were created here in the first 6 weeks are going to continue to carry along for these next 2 to 3 weeks as we are starting to add in more of the speed, the power, the high velocity movements. So importantly, these can be done in any sort of way. Depending on what your end goal is or what your competition is, we can adjust these percentages and intensities and timelines for what we need them to be. I have really taken so much from Cal and from the triphasic method and applied it in so many different ways with effectiveness. He does a really good job of putting things into general constructs for you to come in and apply basically how you do things to that model. So now if we come into kind of the rules versus nuances of programming, on the left side here for the rules, these are all going to be loosely adapted from one of the best, kind of unanimously the best strength and conditioning or sports science books, Science and Practice of Strength Training from Zatsiorsky and Kramer, and forgive me for missing the I there at the end. But anyhow, these are pretty well accepted. These, there's nothing magical over here. We understand progressive overload is required. Specific adaptations to impose demands. The body will respond to what it's subjected to. It's a very unique thing about humans, and it's quite wide-reaching. From there, we kind of right in line have Wolff and Davis's law. So, for Wolff's law, we're thinking about, the adaptation for bones, whereas Davis's law, we're thinking more about the connective tissue. But in either case, I look at this as stress, don't strain, right? We need to find those upper echelon limits that we can get to without incurring damage, but not doing so to the point where we do overtrain or overtax the athlete. We just touched on the RTEs, but this is again important for the timing of stimulus and how you're kind of coordinating your program. Dynamic correspondence or the law of specificity. Specificity, one of the most bastardized things in strength training, bar none. Specificity is simply the combination of force type, vector, speed, energy system, and how long you're doing it for. And that kind of ties right into the law of individuality, which is really just saying that no two athletes respond the same. Now, for the nuances, these are more from my end here. The way that I look at programming is aim for perfect and know you'll never get there. Your program is a living, breathing document. So you're going to put everything together and it's going to look like sunshines and rainbows. You'll walk into the gym on Monday morning and then have it shit on and stepped on a million different ways. So understand you're not going to get there, but you're constantly revising under the premise of aiming for perfect. Beyond that, you're never married to a spreadsheet. And this is something that's very important for athletes to understand. Just because a piece of paper or the program on your phone says that you need to do 5 sets of 5 at 85%, you do not need to feel obligated to that. Your job is to really try to utilize that as a guide and then understand that you have fluctuating variables and fluctuating things in your life that are going to, in a sense, either optimize or de-optimize your eligibility for that workout for that day. Overload for your primaries, variation for your accessories. I'm going to do an independent episode on that, so I won't speak too much of it here. But for the gist, force is a part of, but not the entire solution. We need to have variability in our training. Athlete reciprocity is something that is extremely important to me and I think needs to be a priority for everyone. Understand that you are not this authoritarian that is just telling everybody what to do while they're on your time. You are the certified expert, the contact expert in the environment, but you are trying to create something that needs their input. You are required to get their input to have an improved ability to program. And then lastly, the 80-20 rule. Really, I think that about 80% of the things that any given strength coach in the country or in the world is doing is going to be about the same. What we're trying to do is figure out this 20%, because remember, it's 20% of what you do is really going to drive your results. So I think that this is the imperative aspect where we get most of what we're doing, but we're trying to figure out this back end. So really hone in on that. And to bring this all together quickly here, just giving you a little practical example of how this can differentiate between athletes. So, just very simply here, if we have a college football wide receiver versus a college basketball player, and we have all of our training modes here in the middle, movement and capacity, strength and stability, power and elasticity, speed and sensory, we can see that these are going to be correspondingly different as we go through the season. So for the football athletes, we're gonna have more of an emphasis on volume, strength, size. Whereas for the basketball player, we're really going to be focused more on just developing the aerobic system, the capacity, and then working more towards the power and the elastic side of things. But again, to make the point simple here, most athletes can do almost the entirely the same things, but do them in fluctuating capacities or amounts and then get different outcomes. So, so for the sake of this example, we really just want to focus on how we're distributing these 4 training parameters, these 4 training modes across different points of the training calendar. And then as always, just observe, analyze, and revise. All training modes are going to be in play pretty much at any point in the season. The training calendar, but we're just going to do it in differing amounts. I personally go with a total body session for everything. This is what some people refer to as microdose, but in any case, I think that this is the best way to kind of keep athletes in a state where they are never too taxed to do what they need to do. Most of your parameters are going to be governed for you. Any strength coach who's worked in a team-based setting can understand that. And then really we're just trying to analyze where they are now, what they're trying to do, and how we can help them get there efficiently. Hope y'all enjoyed this first installment here. We will continue to build off of this, and I'm going to shoot for 1 a week for the next couple weeks. And like I said, hopefully get some guests on here too, so you don't have to just listen to me talk what I think is important. But I wanted to leave you with a couple of quick references here. So some textbooks, basically the 4 textbooks that I learned programming from were Cal's Triphasic, Science and Practice of Strength and Conditioning. Eric Cressy's High Performance Handbook is fantastic. If you are a type A, rigid, organized person like myself, you will really enjoy this book here. And then, Mike Boyle's Functional Training for Sport is another one. I think this is particularly great for young strength coaches. He does an excellent job in this of really just covering a wide range of things, and how you can keep the simplistic concepts of training consistent across different populations very well. And then lastly here, Simply Faster, Science for Sport, Altus, and then of course ours, Rude Rock. These are just great continuing ed sites that are going to continue to have a ton of different programming information and content. I would encourage you to check all these out if you haven't already. These links will be provided in the description of this video.